Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up where I share with you all of the books that I read this month. In the month of November, I read 5 books, which is slightly less than usual, but I tend to read slower when I happen to be writing a book of my own, which I was all throughout November. If you want to see how that went, I have a playlist. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. The first book that I read this month was Dollface by Renee Rosen. This book takes place in the 1920s in Chicago and follows a young woman named Vera who is trying to find a better life for herself. Her mother owns a local slaughterhouse and she doesn't want that life for herself, so she's trying to better her circumstances and finds herself involved with 2 handsome men who happen to be from rival gangs in the city. And as you can imagine, conflict ensues. Now, I picked up this book because it does take place in the 1920s. It's a pretty difficult book for me to review, to be honest, because it does have a lot of details in it that I typically don't enjoy, particularly how the romance was handled. I don't usually like my romance to go the direction that it did in this book with the level of detail and all of that. I did appreciate the historical detail. It was clear that a lot of research had gone into this book. Despite not liking a lot of the elements that are in this book, and the romance in particular, I did sort of enjoy this story because I think it all balances out in the end. The logical consequences that would arise from these types of situations do happen, so I appreciated the accuracy of that. The characters make choices, their actions lead them down certain paths, and you as the reader get the feeling, well, if you continue down this way, it's only ever going to end one way, and that's exactly what happens. Vera's character was interesting for me because I didn't exactly like her character. She's a bit too weak and naive for my liking. She's like, I know this guy is bad for me and I shouldn't be around him, but I can't stay away from him, and that frustrates me. But she does learn an important lesson, and I did feel sympathetic toward her, even if I didn't completely like her character. Next up, we have Blind Tiger by Sandra Brown. This is a thriller that also takes place in the early 1920s in Texas when the moonshining business was really starting to heat up. There are 2 main characters in this story, Thatcher Hutton and Laurel Plummer. Thatcher is just returning from the war and he's trying to make his way across the country to the ranch where he was formerly employed, but that doesn't go the way that he planned. He's forced to jump off a train before he can get there, and he arrives in the little town of Foley, Texas. One of the local women in the town goes missing, and because he is a stranger, Thatcher is accused of the crime. Laurel Plummer's husband is a veteran of the war, and he's dealing with what we would consider now post-traumatic stress disorder. He uproots Laurel and their daughter and takes them to where his father lives, and then tragedy ensues and Laurel is forced to consider what she can do to make money to provide for herself, her daughter, and her father-in-law, and she decides to turn to the moonshining business, which eventually puts her and Thatcher on opposite sides of the brimming moonshine war. So, I have a lot of thoughts about this book. I think I'll start with the pacing. It's a very long book. It's over 500 pages long, and whenever I find a book that is this long, I get a little nervous because it has been my experience that most books cannot support this many pages. They just don't have the plot for it, the pacing tends to drag, and things get a bit slow. Some books, of course, can definitely carry that many pages, but I found that this wasn't one of them. Despite the fact that this is supposed to be a thriller, I didn't find it the least bit exciting or thrilling, which makes me very disappointed. Another thing that I thought was wrong with this book, other than the pacing, was the lack of chemistry development between Thatcher and Laurel. It kind of goes like they're both lonely, they both see each other, they think they're hot, and let's hook up. That's basically the extent of the chemistry between them. They're both lonely, and they both find each other attractive. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think it should probably be expanded upon. I would have believed their romance more if it had come across in a more realistic way. Another thing about this book that I didn't like was the romance itself. Reading the summary, which is basically what I gave you at the start, telling you what this book was about, it doesn't mention any hint of romance at all. In fact, it just makes it sound like Laurel and Thatcher are going to be at odds over this moonshining business, and I kind of expected them to be enemies, and I think this book would have been much better if they had been enemies. I've never read any of Sandra Brown's books before, but if you are familiar with her work, then you know that this is a common theme. She seems to write thrilling romances or romantic thrillers, and if I had known that that would have been such a big focus of this book, I probably wouldn't have picked it up. Another theme in her books is that the woman seems to fall for a guy that could possibly be bad for her. There's some doubt as to whether he's really a good guy Or not, he's like the bad boy with the heart of gold, or maybe he's just a bad boy, who knows. Or the woman gets kidnapped by this guy and it turns out that he's not kidnapping her so much as saving her from some sort of horrible circumstances she had before, and she starts to fall in love with him, which I find very problematic. Now that's not what happens in this book, but I still find the relationship between Thatcher and Laurel to be very problematic. Thatcher's character in particular is a problem. He comes across as very lustful and a bit handsy. He disrespects Laurel's personal space and touches her without permission. He tells her something like if she truly wants him to stay away from her, then she had better make sure that she doesn't do anything to dare him, which is basically coming across as, hey, I've never assaulted a woman before, but if I end up assaulting you, it's because you dared me to do it and therefore it's your fault. And I just got the creeps from that sentence when he said it. I think that's very problematic. It's not in the least romantic, especially when Laurel has done literally nothing to tempt him except simply exist. It's just gross, and as a woman myself, it makes me very uncomfortable to read that. I just feel like, towards Laurel, girl, get your gun. She has a gun, and she tells Thatcher to stay away from her, and she doesn't want him around anymore, partly because she recognizes the threat that he poses to her moonshining business, and that if he discovers it, she could be in big trouble. But she doesn't use the gun. Whenever he comes back, it's like he's testing her. He's pushing the boundary that she set. And instead of stand firm and be like, I told you to get out of here, and potentially take a shot at him, she just melts. This is one of the big things I have with romance. It's like the women have no agency. They have no will. They have this goal. They say these things, and then as soon as they're confronted with this hot guy, they just melt. They have no will. They are literally like putty in his hands. And I think I'm going to make a separate video talking about this issue, but it really rubbed me the wrong way with this book. I just don't understand why Laurel is so wishy-washy around Thatcher. He's dangerous, he doesn't respect her. He also fantasizes about her and tells her that he's fantasized about her, which is creepy. Overall, I didn't feel like I knew any of the characters terribly well, and I certainly didn't like any of them. This book does focus on a lot of the residents in the town of Foley, which I thought was a good thing. It did help the story out. It would have been much more lacking if it hadn't done that, but I still didn't like it overall. This is also a hard book for me to review because other than the pacing and the lack of chemistry between Thatcher and Laurel, there's really nothing technically that I can think that was done wrong with this book. I tried to be as objective as possible in my reviews, and I couldn't think of anything objectively other than those things that was wrong with this book. I just subjectively did not like it. On a happier note, now we come to A Corruption of Blood by Ambrose Parry. This is the third book in the Simpson, Raven, and Fisher mystery series, so if you would like to read this series, I recommend you start with the first one, which is called The Way of All Flesh. You can technically read these books out of order, but as a writer myself, I always recommend reading series in order because that's how the writers have written them and how they intended them to be read, and if you don't read this series in order, you will miss out on a lot of the emotional punch that this series packs because you won't understand all of the things that the characters went through together in the previous books. So this series follows three main characters: Dr. Simpson, who is a physician in 1850s Edinburgh, Dr. Raven, who is his assistant, who is a young physician hoping to set up his own practice, and Sarah Fisher, who was a housemaid in Dr. Simpson's practice, but she also became an assistant of sorts. She wishes to practice medicine, but she's finding it very hard because she's a woman and not many doors are open to her. Through a series of events, these characters end up getting involved in mysteries that are surrounding patients of theirs, or they get involved in things. And in this book, Dr. Raven is returning from a house call, basically, and human remains are found in the river, and these remains are very disturbing, and so Raven sets out to find out whose remains these are if he can, and who is responsible for them being dumped in the river. There's lots of subplots in this book that end up tying together very nicely. I love this series. It is very good. It was a pleasure to read. Certainly a 5-star rating from me. The characterization is wonderful. The development of these personalities throughout the series is amazing. You really get to know these characters and care about them, and the struggle really packs a strong emotional punch, which again is why I recommend that you read the whole series. The dialogue is fantastic. It certainly feels Victorian without being overly pretentious or confusing to read. The atmosphere of Victorian Edinburgh is captured very well. I typically read Victorian stories that are set in London, but the city in this series is fleshed out very well. It feels very atmospheric, and I just love this series very much. I have no complaints, and I recommend it to everyone. Next up, we have Murder Knocks Twice by Susanna Calkins. This book also takes place in the 1920s. It follows a girl named Gina who takes a job as a cigarette girl at a speakeasy. She is replacing a girl who used to work there who got murdered on the L This book takes place in Chicago. So naturally, Gina is curious about the girl she's replacing, who murdered her, why did she get killed? And some of the workers at this speakeasy are a little bit suspicious to her. The photographer Marty warns her to be careful, and then Marty is found dead, and Gina is the only witness to his murder. So she has to find out who killed Marty and why, all without knowing who she can trust. So this mystery is a cozy mystery, and I guess I should have figured that out by the cover art. Usually, if a mystery has character art, it's more of a cozy type thing, and if it has like stock photography, it's more gritty. I am not a fan of cozy mysteries. There's only ever been one cozy mystery that I liked. I don't prefer crime stories to be graphic, but I do like them to be gritty and realistic. I found this book to have a very slow pace. The mystery doesn't actually get started until around page 100, so the rest was all just setting things up. And while I appreciated the detail about how the speakeasy operates, it quickly got repetitive just reading about the tasks that Gina goes about doing as part of her employment. As far as the mystery itself goes, I wasn't ever really invested in it. I didn't really care a great deal about it. I didn't feel like I knew Marty enough, and the suspects were never really compelling to me, so it was just kind of like I didn't really care about the mystery itself, and since that is the whole point of a mystery, that's not really a good thing. I also felt like I didn't really know any of the characters. Gina is nice enough. Her motivation is to find work so that she can help her father, who can no longer work himself. There was never anything really more to her than that. There could be, but she never feels fleshed out. Another thing about this book that is kind of nitpicky, but it did bother me, was the name dropping. This book has a tendency to just drop famous names of real people who were around Chicago, I suppose, during the 1920s, but they don't serve any purpose to the plot. They're thrown in here and they don't do anything. They don't need to be in this story, but I guess they're put in there just to name drop because it sounds cool or something. For example, we have the famous attorney Clarence Darrow, Amelia Earhart is thrown in here, but neither of these people's inclusion in the story does anything for it. So overall, this was a very slow read despite its shorter length, really, and the mystery wasn't satisfying. And last but not least, we have A Test of Wills by Charles Todd. Now this is a reread for me because I have read all of the Inspector Rutledge series and this is the very first one. But I wanted something that I knew that I would enjoy, so I went back and reread this, and I love it. I could talk about this series all day, about how amazing it is. The characterization is phenomenal. This is one of those books that makes me as a writer feel a little bit inferior. Like, I want to one day be as good at writing books as this. I want to write books that are this complex and twisty and have characters that are so fleshed out and deep, but maybe one day. But anyway, in this first book, Rutledge is just returning to Scotland Yard after being released. World War I is now over and he can return back to work. However, he's bringing some of the war back with him. He carries in his head the voice of a Scot soldier that was under him that he had to execute for disobeying a direct order. And shortly after he had the soldier executed, a mortar shell exploded near him and his group, killing the rest of his men and burying him in the mud with the man's dead body. So now he carries Hamish's voice in his head. And there's some doubt throughout the series as to whether this is just PTSD. Is it actually Hamish's ghost haunting him? Because there are times when Hamish seems to know things that you wonder how Rutledge could know that if it wasn't a ghost. I find the dynamic between Rutledge and Hamish very interesting and it's very well done. I've certainly never encountered anything else like this in a mystery series, and it makes Rutledge as a detective character much more compelling because of that. So in this first book, Rutledge is sent to a small country village because a colonel has been murdered. He's something of a war hero, he's very well liked and well respected by the people in this village, and the suspect that the clues seem to point to is a captain who also happens to be a celebrated war hero. He's a friend of the king and the Prince of Wales, so naturally if it turns out he's a murderer, it will make the crown look very bad, and it's just a political minefield. To make matters even worse, the only witness to the crime is a shell-shocked soldier, the same as Rutledge, and people, of course, didn't understand PTSD back then. They thought people who were affected by it were cowards, and you can't trust them, and so it's very hurtful to Rutledge, who's trying to heal from his own experience with this, to know that if people knew about his own condition, they would view him the same way they view this witness. And it also makes his job of solving this crime that much harder, because no one's going to believe this witness. If he puts this shell-shocked soldier on the stand, the case will fall apart and this yard will be a laughingstock and his career will basically be over. So he's going to have to try to find a way to solve this crime that doesn't rely solely on the testimony of a shell-shocked soldier. That is very hard to say. Having gone back and reread the first book in this series, I am really surprised at how far Rutledge's character has come throughout the series. I can see how in this first book people may find him unlikable, but he has issues to deal with, and he does deal with them throughout the series remarkably well. I love this series, I love the characters. Rutledge is a very complex, compelling, very well-developed character. The dialogue in this series is amazing. Each of the characters is fleshed out. They all have their own motivation. They all have their own reasons for feeling and doing the things that they do. The mysteries are complex and twisty, and having reread this now, I see the exact moment that you learn the information that you need to solve the crime, and I'm just amazed at how masterfully it was done. So I definitely recommend this series to everyone as well. I have learned a great deal from reading this series about how to write mysteries myself. It has taught me a lot. I enjoy it. I will pick up each of the books in this series as they come out. I'm currently waiting for the next one. So yeah, I don't have anything more to say about this series except that it just gets better and better as it goes on. So that is it. Those are all the books I read during this month. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I upload every week, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!